This is Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson.
Welcome to Citations Needed, a podcast on the media, power, PR, and the history of bullshit. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
You can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and if you are so inclined and not already supporting our show, you can do so through patreon.com/CitationsNeededPodcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated, as we are 100% listener-funded. No ads, no commercials, no sponsors, no grants. We are able to continue doing because of the amazing generosity and support of listeners like you.
Yes, if you can, please support the show on Patreon. It helps keeps the episodes free and the show sustainable.
Susan Rice examines U.S. foreign policy strategy with the Post's David Ignatius. Read a 2016 Washington Post Live title. Key player in war on climate change? The Pentagon, insisted CNN in 2020. Democrats need to learn how to get excited about the center left. The news site The Messenger proclaimed in 2023.
These posts were all facilitated, sponsored, or authored by a member of a Democratic-aligned corporate think tank. Whether the Center for American Progress, the Center for New American Security, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or any other Washington, D.C.-based center with a capital C, center-right to center-left think tanks are ubiquitous in major U.S. media and in democratic policymaking.
This may seem unremarkable, even beneficial. Think tanks, after all, purport to be empirical institutions designed to craft research-based policy proposals. But given the prevalence of corporate funding in the DC think tank world, these claims of neutrality are contradicted by the anti-labor and anti-regulation records of major U.S. think tanks, as well as their function as de facto corporate lobbying groups.
On today's episode, part 2 of our two-part series on the relationship between political party officials, media, and the corporate laundering machine, we'll examine the revolving door between democratic administrations and corporate and despot-funded think tanks, looking at how these institutions effectively serve as a stomping ground for business industry influence on everything from climate to labor to healthcare to infrastructure.
Later on the show, we'll be joined by Akela Lacey, politics reporter at The Intercept.
One of the points that comes to mind when I think about this is the broader issue about the fallacy of objectivity in politics and mass media writ large. Like, everyone has an interest in something, even if it's being, purportedly quote unquote neutral, which particularly in the case of legacy media doesn't actually mean neutrality. It just means concealing who you're giving your ear to, whether that's a donor or an otherwise influential benefactor or someone else behind the scenes. The idea that neutral issues exist naturally in politics is just not how the world works.
This is a spiritual sequel to episode 117, The Always Lagging U.S. War Machine, where we did discuss the role that weapons contractor-funded think tanks play in promoting this idea that the U.S. is always bumbling and stumbling behind the Russians and Chinese, despite having a military that's 5 to 10 times bigger than these countries. So reference that if you'd like. We will be discussing CSIS again a little bit as well, which is kind of the main, most nakedly cynical culprit in this practice of corporate influence laundering. So if you'd like, you can go back and listen to that or not.
Yeah, we like to give options on this show. So do what thou wilt. But let's start this episode by defining what a think tank is, because we're really going to be talking about the power peddling think tank industry, especially in Washington, D.C. So what is a think tank? Now, small caveat here, not every single think tank operates exactly the same way. There are a sprawling collection of organizations throughout the country and throughout the world that call themselves think tanks. By no means can we cover every single one exhaustively, but essentially, think tanks, especially of the DC corporate set, are research-oriented or ostensibly research-oriented organizations that seek to influence public opinion and public policy. Many call themselves nonpartisan or independent, despite the fact that this is almost never actually the case. Now, there have long been institutions, organizations, or groups of intellectuals that get together ever since, say, the Academy in ancient Greece, but these types of institutions that we're talking about, the influence power peddling type, would not be known as think tanks until after World War II. But think tanks date back much farther than that. Formalized think tanks first arose in the first half of the 19th century, primarily in England. Among the earliest think tanks was the British Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, a, quote, defense and security, end quote, organization that was founded in 1831. Another British think tank, Chatham House, attributes the rise of think tanks to such factors as, quote, the decline in the power of the British Empire and the rise of the United States, end quote, as well as, quote, the weakening of colonial systems of government around the world, end quote.
In the 1910s and 1920s, American think tanks began to take off. Among the first major think tanks in the U.S. was the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, founded in 1910 largely as part of a campaign to shape policymaking. The endowment's first president was Elihu Root, a corporate lawyer and former New York Senator and Secretary of War and Secretary of State. Root would later play an instrumental role in the formation of another think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations, otherwise known as CFR. In 1918, Root and over 100 international lawyers and executives in banking, manufacturer, trading, and finance assembled and founded CFR in order to, as CFR in-house historian Peter Gross put it, quote, convene dinner meetings to make contact with distinguished foreign visitors under conditions congenial to future commerce, unquote. A Woodrow Wilson aide stated at the time that the group was, quote, concerned primarily with the effect that the war and the Treaty of Peace might have on post-war business, unquote. So it was largely a kind of business lobby intervention into foreign policy making, because at that time, what was seen as good for business was inherently good for America.
And as a successor to the British model that really arose when British colonial and military might was waning, and so this kind of intellectual force was then assembled through this idea of think tanks. But around the start of the Cold War, pre-existing U.S. think tanks would dedicate their resources to anti-communist influence peddling and the promotion of so-called free market economics. And a number of new think tanks would develop around the same cause. In his 1947 Foreign Affairs article headlined The Sources of Soviet Conduct, CFR member George F. Kennan, who at the time published anonymously as X, proposed a strategy of, quote-unquote, containment regarding the Soviet Union. Kennan wrote this, quote, it is clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies, end quote. By the early 1960s, the anti-communist think tank industry had grown, with a number of new think tanks cropping up, including the Atlantic Council, which was founded in 1961 to preserve and advance the interests of NATO. According to the think tank itself, the Atlantic Council was formed, quote, as a response to the fears that the Western alliance was fragmenting. The initial series of crises that brought the weak Western European states into alliance with the United States in 1949 had been resolved. A prospering Europe had regained its confidence, the danger of an imminent invasion from the East had receded, and Americans wondered about the need to maintain their costly defense commitments, end quote. The Atlantic Council also boasts about its ability, since its inception, to attract corporate funding. It states that during its very first year, its funders included IBM, Heinz, and the Clayton Corporation and Corning Incorporated, both technological manufacturing companies.
To this day, the Atlantic Council is a who's who of corporate funders. Recent and current funders include Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Occidental Petroleum, ExxonMobil, Shell, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, the usual suspects, as well as previously the Aramco, the Saudi regime state oil company. So the Atlantic Council, like CSIS, is a very big pro-military, pro-militaristic think tank that is funded heavily by U.S. oil interest banks, etc. The year after the Atlantic Council was founded in 1962, another major think tank, and that is, like we mentioned often on the show, because of its pernicious influence and its kind of naked corruption, is the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Its founders were Admiral Arleigh Burke and David Apsher, who would later go on to serve as the U.S. ambassador to NATO and sit on the corporate boards for Procter & Gamble and British Petroleum America. CSIS's neoconservative and Republican origins didn't prevent it from becoming a fixture in mainstream media. Among other figures was Paul Craig Roberts, quote, a professor of political economy at CSIS And Assistant Treasury Secretary under Reagan evangelized about supply-side economics throughout the 80s and 90s in the pages of the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. Here's an example from an edition of the Los Angeles Times from June 25th, 1990, in which Roberts panics over a perceived threat of increased state intervention in U.S. industry after the Cold War. Luckily for Roberts, this never happened. The headline is "Harmonizing," in scare quotes, "harmonizing will handcuff the free markets." He would write, "Already we can see within the European community a shift away from reliance on market forces to harmonize national economic differences. Under the leadership of the French socialist Jacques Delors, the new emphasis is on social harmonization achieved through regulatory means. Social regulation designed to equalize labor costs across national boundaries are a subtle form of protectionism from the trade unions in the welfare democracies and French and German business cartels." He would go on to write, quote, "Geoeconomic rivalries could even work to free international business from government controls. Just as international capital markets have made it harder for national central banks to control domestic interest rates, multinational companies are unlikely to come under the sway of national governments. The free market itself is a powerful force, as the rise of extensive informal economies in Latin America and the Soviet Union demonstrate. As a result of 20th century experience, no honest intellectual can make a case for more state intervention." Unquote. So this is kind of classic early sort of Cold War CSIS output, right? It's very, very pro-free market, very pro-corporate and U.S. domination of markets and other kind of post-Cold War economies.
Now, shortly before the time that piece was published, just a year before, in 1989, the Progressive Policy Institute, or PPI, was formed. PPI was the brainchild of the Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC. Now, the DLC was a quote-unquote new Democrat, third-way-style nonprofit founded in 1985 that was chaired by Bill Clinton prior to his 1992 presidential victory. Now, the DLC's mission was to move the Democratic Party even further to the right. This was deemed to be the path to victory. Of course, neither the DLC nor PPI would admit this outright. Part of their purpose was to repackage standard conservatism as a new, innovative type of democratic politics. After praising Clinton for gutting welfare and laying the groundwork for charter schools, both of them patently right-wing positions, PPI co-founder Al Fromm wrote for The Atlantic magazine in 2013 this, quote, "Though the political shorthand had always referred to the DLC as moderate or conservative Democrats, our ideas were really about modernizing liberalism and defining a new progressive center for our party, not simply pushing it further to the right. Coming from the center left of the party, I was tired of having the DLC labeled as conservative. I decided to call our think tank the Progressive Policy Institute, because I thought it would be harder for reporters to label it as the, quote, conservative Progressive Policy Institute, end quote."
Well, that's kind of a good admission, because I think he knows that to the extent to which any pro-corporate disclosure is ever availed by reporters, which we'll discuss with our guest, it is done in these kind of lazy right versus left. And so it doesn't matter if a think tank takes a ton of money from corporate America or from despotic Gulf regimes or from weapons makers. So long as they're vaguely aligned with the Democratic Party, they're called center left or progressive, right?
If you put the word progressive in the title of your center right think tank.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, it's rare that people are kind of openly Orwellian like that. It's good.
Well, it was long enough afterwards. That was 2013 that he finally admitted that. So upon its launch, though, PPI released a paper calling the minimum wage regressive and anachronistic. The paper sought to persuade Democrats to focus instead on increasing the highly conditional Earned Income Tax Credit, otherwise known as the EITC. Now, shortly after that initial paper was published, this now in March 1990, the New York Times ran an article headlined, quote, "Rise in Minimum Wage Offers Minimum Joy," end quote, with PPI's own Vice President Robert J. Shapiro among its sources. Shapiro, who is now a chairman at a private consultancy firm, authored the report on the minimum wage and would go on to become an advisor to both Bill Clinton and subsequently Barack Obama. Clinton indeed expanded the EITC while gutting a number of beneficial government assistance programs like the Supplemental Security Income, or SSI.
Though it doesn't disclose its donors, journalists have uncovered that over the years, PPI received funding from ExxonMobil, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, a big pharma lobby, tobacco giant Altria. Actually, I think I revealed that when I wrote an article last summer. I don't usually do reporting, but I actually did. I found that. I wrote an article for my Substack called Corporate America's Attempt to Rebrand Centrist Politics for Zoomers, which goes over the various corporate influences of PPI, which is, it's also funded by Walmart, Amazon. And so they tried to do a rebrand recently where they bought the Twitter account and brought under the fold this Twitter account called Neoliberal. They put it a 0 where the O is supposed to be. They were originally a Reddit page, but they also have a fairly large Twitter following. And their whole thing is they're like openly neoliberal. They do a tournament every year where they have like the best neoliberal shill. I guess they're supposed to kind of put a lampshade on the fact that they are funded by tobacco companies, oil companies. I guess to be ironic about it, it sort of doesn't count.
If you make it cute, then it's cool.
Right. And so they do this sort of run-of-the-mill, like, you know, we can't do purity politics. They ran an op-ed. One of their quote-unquote fellows ran an op-ed in the Messenger, which has since been shut down, entitled, Democrats Need to Learn How to Get Excited About the Center Left. And then they repeatedly refer to themselves as, quote, grassroots and, quote, unquote, pragmatically liberal and, quote, unquote, progressive. Again, it's part of this, the doth protest too much defensive strategy, where they would basically go on and say that youthful voters need to suck it up, get behind Biden, and support other centrists because we are told, not on merits, right? Not because their ideology is conservative, because you can't say that because you're a Trojan horse operation, right? You can't sort of openly say we're conservative. So you say we support these people because they're more likely to win, or they're more likely to sort of get House seats, right? Because that sounds better. That way it's a sort of pragmatic triangulation towards some vague progressive ends. It just so happens that they also happen to take money from Big Pharma, from ExxonMobil, from tobacco companies, Walmart, Amazon. That's kind of incidental to that. So PPI has been one of the kind of more, I think, overtly sleazy corporate funded. They don't disclose their funders. The only way we know about these fundings is either through investigative reporting, one of which by our guest, who noted their huge uptick in Big Pharma funding right as they were bashing Bernie Sanders in 2019 for supporting a single-payer healthcare. And the disclosures on the other end, the disclosures by Walmart and Amazon, who are on their end. But they themselves, like a lot of these organizations, American Enterprise Institute, somewhat famously, Heritage Foundation, they don't disclose their donors. And that makes it difficult for people to sort of gauge who's buttering their bread.
Now, we will return to PPI when we speak with our guest, Akela Lacey. But in the meantime, let's talk about some other prevalent Democratic-aligned think tanks that were founded in the first decade of the 2000s. One of them, the Center for American Progress, or CAP, debuted in 2003. Its founder, John Podesta, is a former chief of staff to Bill Clinton, and claimed he created CAP to counter overly right-wing think tanks across Washington, D.C., those like the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute, amid a climate of liberal opposition to the Bush administration, right when it was invading Iraq. Funding came, at least in part, from billionaire George Soros and banker Herb Sandler, who helped advance the adjustable rate mortgages partly responsible for the housing crash of the late 2000s. Since its inception, CAP has also taken money directly from corporations, but it didn't make its corporation funding sources public for at least the first 10 years of its existence. Journalist Ken Silverstein, who wrote a think tank expose for The Nation magazine in 2013, obtained a list from 2011 showing dozens of these undisclosed corporate funders, including Comcast, Walmart, General Motors, Pacific Gas and Electric, General Electric, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin.
This has resulted in many conflicts of interest, but are really just glimpses into how U.S. think tanks work. So according to Silverstein, around 2011, CAP received donations from First Solar, a renewable energy firm. First Solar wouldn't reveal to Silverstein how much money it gave. But at the time, CAP was a major proponent of a $25 billion loan guarantee program from the Energy Department for private sector renewable energy projects. The think tank published a post on its site, Think Progress, in July 2011, singing the praises of First Solar, among other companies, and arguing for more subsidies from Congress as part of this program. One of the authors was Steve Spinner, a former Silicon Valley investor and top fundraiser for Obama in 2008. CAP has also had a history of urging the continuation of U.S. arms sales on behalf of weapons manufacturers. In 2010, Scott Lilly, a senior fellow at CAP, argued in an address that the U.S. should sell additional weapons to Taiwan. At the time, Lilly was also a lobbyist for Lockheed Martin, a leading arms deal in Taiwan. CAP received at least $38 million in corporate donations between 2014 and 2021. And its current roster of donors includes Amazon, Microsoft, the Walton family, who owns Walmart, the Verizon, Wells Fargo, and Google. It has also taken money from the healthcare industry, namely companies like Blue Shield and Signify Health. So it may come as no surprise then that the New York Times' David Leonhardt in February of 2018 promoted CAP's Medicare Extra, an attempt to counter the prevailing rising push for a single-payer healthcare system that was advocated, obviously, most notably by Bernie Sanders, who was ramping up to run for president in 2020, RIP. Leonhardt would write, quote, "The crucial difference between the Sanders plan and the Center for American Progress, CAP plan, is that the CAP version would not force people to give up their current employer insurance coverage. Those who are covered through their jobs would either keep the plan or enroll in Medicare Extra. The Sanders plan, by contrast, would eliminate employer-provided insurance in favor of a single federal system." Unquote. Now, lest the plan be viewed as too left-wing, Leonhardt added that he, quote, "liked a lot of the CAP plan, but found it, quote, too sweeping and ambitious for, quote, reasons of realpolitik." Ooh, realpolitik, he's so savvy.
Even the corporate version was too lefty for Leonhardt.
Well, there was a few versions that kind of emerged. I remember like around 2017, 2018, that magically emerged out of the woodwork to do a kind of pseudo national healthcare plan. I think there was real fears from the healthcare industry that there was going to be a real push for a single payer system. In retrospect, seems quite quaint and funny, but no, there was all kinds of new versions where it's like, and then of course you had Pete Buttigieg's, single payer for whoever wants it. It's like, that's not how single payer works. You have to pool resources or the whole thing collapses.
Yeah, single payer.
The second you start letting people check out of government systems, then the government system doesn't really work.
4 years after the launch of CAP, in 2007, another Democrat-aligned and Republican-friendly think tank, the Center for a New American Security, or CNAS, was founded. While CAP's focus was mostly on domestic policy, CNAS's was on foreign policy. Its founders were two former Defense Department officials from the Clinton administration, Kurt Campbell and Michelle Flournoy. Flournoy was later a candidate for Secretary of Defense under Joe Biden, ultimately not obtaining that position. But as the Revolving Door Project notes, quote, "The organization's official launch event in 2007 featured remarks by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and keynote speeches by Senators Hillary Clinton and Chuck Hagel, President Obama's future Secretaries of State and Defense, respectively," end quote.
So it launched as a ramp up for the Clinton presidency in 2008, but then Obama won. So then he kind of handed foreign policy, obviously the Secretary of State, over to the Clinton kind of circle. And so shortly after its launch, the Wall Street Journal reported that the think tank, quote, "is rapidly emerging as the top farm team for the incoming Obama administration," unquote. CNAS presented itself as capital S, capital F, capital P, very, serious foreign policy, right? Everyone's sort of serious. Everyone's expert. Everyone has history within these organizations. They've revolved through, various corporate consultancies and weapons contractors. And so it was naturally a very hawkish think tank due to its funding by weapons contractors. Since at least 2011, CNAS has received major funding from the Big Five: Boeing, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, and at least 24 other weapons makers, according to their public disclosures. To their credit, they do actually disclose on their website all the large weapons manufacturer logos. With these connections, CNAS has built a very chummy relationship with the media, kind of providing the liberal perspective of foreign policy events, this sort of liberal wing of the weapons contractor industry. In 2016 alone, CNAS co-sponsored 4 Washington Post live events, one of which was also co-sponsored by Raytheon. I wrote an article in Fair at the time about that, where Washington Post columnist David Ignatius spoke with national security and intelligence officials. The one sponsored by Raytheon, Susan Rice, is sitting under a large Raytheon logo. CNAS staffers are published and reported frequently in the New York Times and elsewhere on topics ranging from the importance of women working in national security to Russian and Chinese disinformation, which they are qualified to work on as national security experts. Similarly, a think tank involved in this kind of weapons contractor, Saudi-funded, U.S. military-funded, frankly, kind of horizontal propaganda model is CSIS, which we mentioned earlier, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Just sort of one example, which I thought was pretty naked, which we have mentioned on the show about 4 years ago, but I'll mention here again because I think it's sort of worth highlighting as a kind of case study. I wrote an article in 2017 for Fair entitled "Lockheed Martin-Funded Experts Agree South Korea Needs More Lockheed Martin Missiles." So there were several quotes that quoted CSIS that were either advocating the underlying premise of the thermal high-altitude area defense, the THAAD missile system in South Korea, or openly lobbying for it, openly advocating for it. Now, the THAAD missile system was very controversial in South Korea because it was seen as being provocative. There were protests against it. Some polls show the majority of South Koreans opposed it. They ended up building it anyway. Not a huge majority, slight majority, but it was very controversial. But one would not know this reading Western press, which routinely sought the opinion of CSIS. Quote, THAADs are tailored to those medium-range threats that North Korea has in spades. North Korea regularly demonstrates that kind of capability, says Thomas Karako, the director of Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic International Studies. THAADs are exactly the kind of thing that you would want for a regional area.
Also exactly the thing that CSIS's funders would want in that region.
Yeah.
Shocking.
This was April 2017. This is from AFP, France 24, May of 2017. But CSIS's Karako called THAAD an important first step. This is not about having a perfect shield, but it is about buying time and thereby contributing to the overall credibility of deterrence. This is from the Christian Science Monitor from July of 2016. THAAD is a decent option, says Thomas Karako, director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic International Studies. This is from VOA, Voice of America. Seeing THAAD as a natural consequence of an evolving threat from North Korea, Bonnie Glaser, a senior advisor for Asia at the Center for Strategic International Studies, told Voice of America that Washington should continue to tell Beijing the system is not aimed at China. Victor Cha, a Korean expert and former White House official now at the Center for Strategic International Studies, played down the chances that THAAD would be rolled back, saying, quote, if THAAD is deployed prior to the elections and given the North Korean missile threat, I don't think it would be prudent for the new government to ask it be walked back. That was Reuters in March of 2017. Voice of America, January 2017, what goes on and on and on. CSIS populates the entire discourse around the importance of the THAAD missile system. But they didn't note that omitted from all these CSIS media appearances is that CSIS's top donor, number one donor, is THAAD's primary military contractor, Lockheed Martin, that the THAAD system is worth about $3.9 billion in contracts alone. And not only is Lockheed Martin a major CSIS funder, but it is the main funder of their missile defense project. So it's not even that they're funding the think tank itself, they're funding the actual project that the talking head works for. It's a clear as day conflict of interest. And what makes it even more notable is that the New York Times itself outed CSIS and the Brookings Institute, but primarily CSIS, as being undisclosed lobbyists in August of 2016. So the New York Times wrote a report, quote, as a think tank, the Center for Strategic International Studies did not file a lobbying report, but the goals of the effort were clear. So New York Times got their hand on a bunch of internal emails basically showing CSIS was a lobbying front for weapons makers. This is quoting the email that they got their hands on. Political obstacles to export read the agenda of one closed-door working group meeting organized by Mr. Brannon that included Tom Rice, a lobbyist for General Atomics, Washington office. On the invitation list, the email shows Boeing and Lockheed Martin drone makers that were major CSIS contributors were also invited to attend the session. The emails show the meetings and research culminated with a report released in February of 2014 that reflected the industry's priorities. Quote, I came out strongly in support of export, Mr. Brennan, the lead author of the study, wrote in an email to Kenneth B. Handelman, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Defense Trade Controls. But the effort did not stop there. Mr. Brennan initiated meetings with Defense Department officials and congressional staff to push for the recommendations, which also included setting up a new Pentagon office to give more focus on acquisition and deployment of drones. The Center for Strategic International Studies also stressed the need to ease export limits at the conference it hosted in its headquarters, featuring top officials from the Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, unquote. This is from the New York Times in August of 2016. So, the New York Times, and I wrote about this afterwards, the New York Times exposes CSIS using internal emails as a very, very, very transparently corrupt lobbying front for the weapons industry. And then months later, they're just quoting CSIS again about the need to buy ice cutters.
Think tank expert at CSIS says,
and there's no indication anything changed. There's no new firewalls. There's no, again, academic rigor involved in this.
They don't start disclosing those things better than they, hadn't done before.
And of course, the average person sitting at home reading things like PP, Progressive Policy Institute, or Center for, Strategic and International Studies. They always have these very kind of banal sounding generic names. The North Center for Defense Priorities, whatever. They're not going to know what that means. They don't know who these people are funded by. And the argument we would make in this episode, I think a very liberal argument, a very sort of safe argument, is that they should probably disclose that.
Right. If you're quoting the director of the Missile Defense Project that is funded by Lockheed Martin, you might want to disclose that. I don't know.
You may want to know what the general tenor of, because again, the one disclosure they have is they'll say conservative leaning. And it's but that makes it seem purely ideological when a lot of these cases, especially with CNAS, CSIS, and these more overtly lobbying organizations that literally build stories, bring them to journalists, have them report out like the importance of investing in this new submarine or this new ice cutter.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is not whether they're right or left. These concepts in this context don't make any sense. The issue is, are they funded by weapons contractors? Because if I, according to this fellow at this, such and such that receives $4.5 million a year from Lockheed Martin, has a different tenor than like right leaning or progressive leaning, which kind of says like, oh, they're kind of for Democrats or they're for Republicans, but it's not. They're just for a bloated military budget because it's a fucking gravy train. I mean, this is easy, free money. Think about all the times in your life you've struggled to work an extra shift as a waiter or to do Uber at night so you could pay for your, kid's birthday party or whatever. Think about all those times you struggled. Now imagine getting like 10,000 times more than that. And all you have to do is convince a few Congress people or plug a few quotes into an article. It's easy money. It's free money. It's free lobbying. It's cheap. And, if you're a parasite looking to bloat the defense budget, it's kind of a no-brainer in terms of investment.
Yeah, the lack of disclosure is really stark. And then when you kind of realize that these are the experticians that are littering our media with their quotes and their thoughts on policy, thoughts on budgets, thoughts on where our priorities should be as a society, you realize kind of how closed the loop is. So to discuss this more, we are now going to be joined by Akela Lacey, politics reporter at The Intercept. Akela will join us in just a moment. Stay with us. We are joined now by Akela Lacey. Akela, thank you so much for joining us today on Citations Needed.
Thank you for having me.
So this is the second part of a two-part episode. We previously examined corporate lobbying and consultancy, revolving door of the Democratic Party, which we argue sort of creates a culture of venality, which cements a kind of ideological limitations, a very small ideological bubble, because everyone's kind of just waiting to cash in, or they're friends with someone who's kind of waiting to cash in. So they're kind of what we call a gentleman's agreement to kind of not mention how obviously corrupt many of these practices are. But a more subtler mode of this exists within the think tank world, which we spent discussing at the top of the episode. And they're also more directly involved in media curation. Obviously, people at shady consulting groups that do corporate advising or polling, quote unquote polling, can appear on MSNBC and CNN. But think tanks populate stories because they're seen as being objective or kind of pseudo-neutral observers. They're kind of a quasi-academic institution. Now, obviously, it's a spectrum, and really what we're focusing on is what we call kind of corporate think tanks. Ones that take money from weapons contractors, sort of foreign dictatorships, et cetera. And in the case of what you wrote about, the ironically named Progressive Policy Institute, they take money from people like Altria, ExxonMobil. They're kind of on the more overtly corporate funded end of the spectrum. We discussed, I wrote about them last year. You've written about them. Let's begin by talking about PPI and what you view their role, especially if you could talk about their role in the 2019 primary and how that can kind of be seen as an object lesson in these corporate think tanks.
Yeah, so the story that we did back in 2019 basically found that pharma was funding PPI at the same time that they were driving the fight to derail the push for Medicare for All. This was even before the first congressional hearings on Medicare for All in 2019. You can sort of see how far we've gotten with that. But PPI is the think tank wing of what was previously the Democratic Leadership Council, which was a faction of the Democratic Party organized in the mid-1980s with the aim to sort of staunch the push to move the party to the left, in response to Ronald Reagan's presidency. So Bill Clinton was a previous chair of DLC. Some of his sort of neoliberal policies were adopted by PPI after the DLC ceased to function. And basically, the story that we did was talking about the funding that PPI gets from pharma and the role that they played sort of in very closely, mimicking the same sorts of policy goals that pharma has had in derailing Medicare for All, making the argument that it's too costly, that it wouldn't work, X, Y, and Z, talking points that are then parroted by House Democratic Party leadership, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of the Medicare for All fight, they were putting out papers sort of arguing at the time where there was, lots of polling showing the support for Medicare for All. PPI is releasing reports arguing that the support for Medicare for All is purely a result of the pushes from these fringe left activists. making sort of derogatory claims that these are people who haven't thought through the issue. They think it's,
well, naturally, yeah.
one size fits all cure that hasn't actually been thought through, and sort of scolding progressives for pushing, quote unquote, disruptive and costly programs instead of trying to fix the Affordable Care Act.
Mm-hmm.
So
be more realistic, you hippies.
Yeah, because that's the answer to everything, right?
Yeah, no, again, if you're astroturfing as a sort of ostensibly progressive institute, you can't say like this is bad on principle, right? You can't do a kind of Koch brothers thing. So you do the next best thing, which almost all centrist astroturfed operations do, which is nuance troll, implementation troll. It's very difficult. It's very inscrutable. We need like 50 years to figure this out. We have a bunch of studies we're working on, but trust me, we sort of nominally appreciate or agree with your goal.
We agree in theory, but in practice, this is really not.
Yeah, but it's so difficult.
Not going to happen. So yeah, I kind of want to get to this idea of something you kind of nodded to, Akela, like the closed loop argument here, right? So there's obviously a bigger psychological and ideological aspect of all of this. Your researchers, your writers, etc., they of course would never consider themselves to be like on the corporate take, or that their ideas are being shaped by their funding sources, right? By their donors. But clearly there's a filtering bias that does a lot of this for them, right? They wouldn't necessarily be hired as a fellow or as an expert if they hadn't previously shown an ideological preference for, say, things like neoliberal policies, deregulation, et cetera, et cetera. But they have a tendency to still kind of like clutch pearls and, head to the fainting couch whenever the subject of corporate influence is brought up. And as you yourself wrote in that 2019 piece, again, referencing the Progressive Policy Institute, PPI, you wrote this, quote, PPI is adamant that its corporate support has no influence over its policy positions. In a response to a request for the group's latest annual report, the Institute's executive director, Lindsay Lewis, told The Intercept, this is their quote, "Our researchers do not know our list of donors, nor what they give. We have no donor control or donor board. Our writers are independent and free to come to any conclusions they have. If you are attempting to question the integrity of our writers and researchers, I would think clear evidence would be needed. It doesn't exist because it's a false narrative," end quote.
Did anyone read that like a Elizabethan, like, if you are questioning the integrity of our writers,
yeah, right, throwing down the gauntlet.
I challenge you to a duel.
Oh my God.
Sir, how dare you say that Philip Morris
Yeah,
informs
exactly.
us?
What's the deal with this feigned indignation, basically? Why is it unconvincing?
First of all, let's start with the question of okay, why is pharma involved in politics or policy at all? Why do they give to campaigns? Why do they fund think tanks? Why do they pay lobbyists? It's obviously to influence policy. This is not a secret. It's why half of Washington exists. This is a basic thing that you learn in political science, elementary political science classes. So the idea that it's offensive to ask a major think tank funded by a major corporate lobbying group that is also spending tens of millions of dollars every year on politics, the idea that it's offensive to ask whether that has any influence on their policy prescriptions, which just happen to align more or less perfectly with what their donors are pushing, despite being opposed to popular opinion, is just on its face illogical. And as far as the individual think tank PPI, we're not talking about chump change. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars and beyond that, there are other corporate donors we're talking about in the millions of dollars. And this was a long time ago when we wrote this article. So it could be, I think at the time it was hundreds of thousands of dollars that pharma had given to PBI over, 2 or 3 years.
Well, what was weird is they gave him 50,000, and then
right.
in the 2019 primary, it was an anomaly. They gave him over $250,000. And then they went back to 50,000 after that. So clearly there was something going on in 2019 that PPI urgently had to address with respect to Medicare for All and Big Pharma.
Right. And so the idea that that's an offensive question to ask is unserious and is meant for people who don't understand how this stuff works. And it's also, she's getting at this idea that you always have plausible deniability if you can't prove intent or direct pay to play. And that is not the point. And I think that is the intent of this person's comment, to distract people from the point, which is, why is this pharmaceutical lobbying corporation spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to back a group that's influencing healthcare policy? And it's our job as journalists to ask that question. And the response is often more telling than the question. And I think that's, this is a case of that for sure.
Yeah, no, I want to talk about this kind of psychological aspect of it, because obviously, again, nobody wants to sort of see themselves as being on the take. And again, I think a lot of the ideological filtering of hiring does kind of take care of a lot of that. I do think a lot of people genuinely feel like they can kind of say whatever they want, but of course, that's why they're in the chair, right? That's why they have a cushy $150,000 think tank job. But I do think you can see the ways in which donors influence. Anyone who's ever worked in a nonprofit, which I have, you can see the way donors influence people. Anyone who says they're lying to you is bullshit. What really matters is, in many ways, is kind of who the donor is, right? Like, I know at certain institutions, they'll get like 10% of their money from unions. And then be like, oh, well, you're on the take of big union. I'd be like, well, yeah, because unions are good. Like, I don't care. Like, you know what I mean? Like if a good union with decent politics was like funding my podcast and be like, oh, you're corrupted by the union. I'd be like, yeah, because they're good. But when it's Altria, you can't really, or ExxonMobil or Amazon, you can't really make that argument because they're kind of generally seen as being probably not good, or, they're not they're not representing workers, et cetera. And so what you do is you get this kind of preciousness. And this goes back to the gentleman's agreement, because again, everybody's kind of operate within that murky territory. And it is a gradient. Certain think tanks have more diffuse funding models. They maybe are more some foundation money here or there. They're kind of user supported, and they'll produce work. Because like you said, a lot of this is empirical. It's outcome based. Like, does your work you produce generally align with your donors? In an organization like PPI, it's like 95%. They'll throw in the 5% to throw the cent off, but generally it's just kind of neoliberal bullshit they publish. And I think that's why the issue of, like you said, it just so happens to always do it, is really kind of the marker here, because human beings are pattern-seeking mammals, and we kind of look for inferences, and it would be awfully coincidental, right? And again, like you go to the question is like, why would these lobbying groups give to think tanks, or big corporations give to think tanks, if it wasn't to exert influence?
Because they're out of the goodness of their heart. Yeah,
right.
No.
And again, this is a premise we accept with foreign media. Like, when someone says, "Oh, Russia funds this or China funds that," it's seen as sort of inherently sinister. It's like, well, yeah, because they want to influence something. Like, obviously, we take it for a given for other baddie countries, but for us, it's, oh, there's a firewall and the guy's got a PhD, and it's like, yeah, because he can make twice as much and do half the work at a think tank than he can in academia. No shit.
Right. And pay attention to which think tank they're at, right? Like, it's not just, oh, they're at a think tank. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, as you said, Adam, like, there's a spectrum, but which think tank are these people writing for, and who funds those think tanks? And usually you can draw a straight line to see like why this is a communications tool that is worth corporations spending lots of money on.
Yeah. And I also think, something that is implicit in the comments that they gave us for this story is like that there's no link between the funding and what their policies are, but that they just are pushing what's good policy. And like the fact that that happens to align with what their donors also want is totally irrelevant. The bottom line is that pharma is involved in policy because they will lose money if the alternative policy is passed. And like, you can't sort of divorce yourself from that outcome, particularly when there is study after study after study, poll after poll after poll that's saying that not only is pharma opposed to this because they'll lose money, not only is this popular with the majority of people who live in this country, like, there is evidence that the people who are pushing this policy are actually causing material harm, and that what PPI is doing is running cover for them so that they can, instead of address the material harm that's being caused, they let the robbers run out the back door and punch left and blame it all on progressives. And it's completely a distraction from the material effects of what they're actually doing, which is running interference for people who want to make as much money as possible and have no interest in providing healthcare.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, and you can kind of look at that at any angle, right? I mean, Raytheon is going to fund CSIS and not fund the American Friends Service Committee. And there's a reason why, right? I mean, not that AFSC would take that money, but like, clearly there are incentives to funding the thing that then will make your case for you with this kind of seemingly objective voice.
This goes into the gentleman's agreement to all act like it's there's real firewalls, and everybody knows there's not. I mean, it's bullshit. Anyone who spent 5 minutes, anywhere in the nonprofit world knows that donors have influence. Obviously, different donors are more active and more influential than others, but generally it's true. But everyone has to, again, reach for the smelling salts when you mention it. But I want to talk a bit about this idea of disclosure, because I think this is kind of, and we talked about this with our previous guest, Jeff Hauser, which is like, okay, fine. But people should know. There should be some kind of disclosure if there is a conflict, even if it is seemingly tangential. But if I'm a CSIS talking head and I'm on CNN talking about North Korea or the threat of Hamas or whatever, I should probably disclose that my program is funded by weapons contractors by and large. Like that seems reasonable. It's a reasonable form. But that just doesn't exist. And the reason why it doesn't exist is because if that did exist, if there was basic disclosure laws, then there would be literally almost no reason for these corporate think tanks.
Yeah.
Because their entire value is that they feign objectivity. They feign some pseudo-academic credentials, therefore giving them more credibility to both reporters, TV bookers, but also the media consumer. Mm-hmm. And so I remember once I was talking to this abolitionist activist who was talking about trying to get a minimum wage in prisons, that they were going to go on strike or try to pass legislation to get minimum wage in prison. Because if you have a minimum wage in prison, you basically eliminate the value of prison labor overnight, and you basically abolish prison slavery overnight because it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you have to act aggressively and transparently disclose think tanks, I think you kind of abolish corporate think tanks overnight. That's not to say there still won't be some here and there that aren't, aren't as corrupt, but like the disclosure would kind of defeat the purpose. It would sort of eliminate the reason why you would have a lot of these institutions we've been discussing on the show. So I want to talk about disclosure and what you think, like if you had to sort of be prescriptive here, what do you think a reasonable disclosure would be? What would that look like? And also, as a sort of correlator to that, what can bookers or TV bookers or editors are listening to this right now, what should they disclose in your mind? Because again, the only disclosure they ever do is like right-leaning think tank. It's kind of just like as if it's kind of a purely ideological. What would that look like to you, and what would, on both sides, both in terms of the actual think tank, but also the sort of people using them as part of their media collateral?
Yeah. I want to zoom out for a second. I mean, we've done some reporting on this too, like the proliferation of defense industry veterans, suddenly appearing as CNN analysts, et cetera, et cetera. I think one of the points that comes to mind when I think about this is the broader issue about the fallacy of objectivity in politics and mass media writ large. Like everyone has an interest in something, even if it's being, purportedly quote unquote neutral, which particularly in the case of legacy media, doesn't actually mean neutrality. It just means concealing who you're giving your ear to, whether that's a donor or an otherwise influential benefactor or someone else behind the scenes. The idea that neutral issues exist naturally in politics is just not how the world works. And I'm not saying that means you can't do things fairly. I'm just saying that the idea that there's any way to present somebody who is working for one of these think tanks or coming from, the defense industry or the pharmaceutical industry to frame them as a neutral person, like that is a weapon that is used to protect the status quo. And I do think people are starting to see that. But I say all that to say that I am not totally sure that I think enhancing the disclosure process would solve the problem as much as it would be beneficial to train journalists to press experts, quote unquote experts, on their industry ties in real time. Like, so not just saying like, here we have an expert from the right-leaning AEI, like having your CNN anchor or whoever it is, ask that person, like, why should you be trusted as a neutral voice on this issue if you're being paid by the interested industry? I think people should certainly be just, forced to disclose their ties, but I kind of feel like that's only half the battle. And unfortunately, like, even if that were the norm, the average media consumer is not necessarily conditioned to ask those questions or be primed to understand sort of what that tie means for the information that they're consuming. So again, like, journalists have to do everything. Like, we as journalists need to like make those connections crystal clear for people so that they can draw their conclusions. And like one of the examples, I mean, this is sort of in the weeds, but like lobbying disclosures, for example, have not had their intended effect, like on sort of making people more skeptical about the influence of industry or the, the power that they have. And I mean, there's a lot that you could say about that. It's obviously tailored to journalists. It's tailored to people who work in the policy space so they can find, their next lobbyist. It's not tailored to the average, concerned citizen who wants to know who they just saw talking on CNN. But it's like, and obviously I think they would legally have to disclose if they were a lobbyist, but that's sort of besides the point. But I don't know that like that sort of form of disclosure has had the intended effect. So I certainly agree that it would hamper the influence of corporate think tanks. But on the other hand, I feel like they would probably find a way to keep kicking. But that solution that I'm proposing might spell one way to sort of keep chipping away at the chokehold that industry has on the policy process. But again, like, I do think industry influence will have a say, whether it's a think tank or a lobbyist or a fundraiser. But I think like the way to make whatever disclosure regime exists to make it more robust is having journalists paint the picture for people more clearly and encouraging, media, for instance, to be as open to quoting, an anti-war expert as they are to quoting people who sit on the boards of weapons manufacturers. I think that is sort of the key.
Right, because one thing that we talked about is that, and we talked about this at the top of the show, but a lot of people don't quite appreciate how much these think tanks do the reporters' work for them.
Oh, yeah.
They pitch them story, they have sexy graphics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the reporter kind of looks at it and says, yeah, I don't know, these guys seem serious. They have a PhD, Naval Academy, etc.
That sounds right.
CSIS is very good at this. I mean, that's what they do. They spend all their time kind of pitching stories and they do the work for them. So it's a huge, huge cost-cutting thing, which again, they can't do that if I'm Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. I can't go directly to the New York Times and say, write this story about how scary the North Koreans are and how much we need the THAAD missile system. So if I just add an extra step and fund the CSIS, it gives it the veneer of it's just influence laundering. It's just a laundromat. That's all it is.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't have high hopes that this will become part of the journalist training at, your daytime television news company. But we are starting to see sort of the veneer crack in some respects on this. And I see parallels. This is not something that just applies to corporate influence in media. I think it applies to so many issues, environmental issues, Gaza, criminal justice. Like, there is a shadow governance structure that, works hand in hand with mainstream media to sort of, again, as you said, launder the narrative on this. And so, yeah, I think the more that journalists are given the resources to sort of push back on that in real time, the more that we'll be able to push back on some of that stuff.
I don't necessarily think we're going to solve this all right now, but I do want to note, look, let's accept the premise that there is a need in terms of informing the public, in terms of coming up with different ideas about policy, that independent research is good, necessary for education, again, for policymaking, and that needs to be done also outside the context of, say, government or publicly funded institutions. So let's accept that, okay, not only government-funded institutions should be doing research or can be doing research. And to be kind of fair here, getting money to do this sort of policy wonk stuff research is hard, especially if you aren't at a place that's Koch-funded or Heritage or Manhattan Institute. It is hard to get funding for that work. And so a lot of think tanks will solicit corporate money because in many ways, that's the money that is available, right? So I'm just thinking about, where do you think this funding could come from? Again, accepting the premise that independent research is good and should exist. And one could argue that academia is a bit more independent, although donors, as we know, huge influence there, but maybe are not as directly on the corporate take as a lot of these think tanks. But, what might be kind of less sleazy ways to have this kind of research funded?
Yeah, I will accept the premise that think tank research is inherently valuable, but I also don't, we don't have to go into this. I have some disagreements with that, but I think there should be independent research. I'm not saying, I only say that to say that I do think that the current structure, and I'm really mostly talking about think tanks, is sort of oversaturated and fertile ground for what I've already described as sort of this shadow governance structure where the highest bidder gets the strongest influence, just because there is sort of this internal ecosystem of these think tanks that sort of feed off of one another. But that's sort of a DC problem. I do certainly think it's important for there to be independent research on this stuff, because God knows that lawmakers are not reading the bills that they're signing. So, my less cynical take would be that, my first thought is public sector, but I do think that there should be more opportunities for, again, university funding. The alternative is, rich people who are not Lockheed Martin former executives and potentially are not necessarily hardcore centrists ponying up some money for that. But as soon as I think about that, then I think about, Arnold Ventures or I don't know, the Council on Criminal Justice, and I'm sort of in the criminal justice wheelhouse, so my brain is a little bit there.
But then you get into philanthropy funding, which is its own nightmare.
Yeah, and like those are the people who like thought it was a good idea to like put, drones to fly over Baltimore and monitor. Like it's like you get crazy shit like that. And it's like, okay, well, let's reel it back in for a second. I think that we should be aiming to get money out of this system, but unfortunately that's not the world that we live in. And so I guess if I had to say, maybe this is not popular, but I wish that there were more sort of less restricted grants, opportunities, partnerships with government and other sort of, whether it's a nonprofit agency or sort of like a Center for Popular Democracy or something like that, where you could potentially facilitate some of this stuff. But my counterpoint to that is that I think that at least on the left, a lot of these groups end up taking on way more than they can chew. They're doing electoral, they're doing organizing, they're doing all this stuff, and then you end up not doing anything very well. So it's not a great landscape.
But there's also a pipeline problem there, because actually, as I think you certainly know as a reporter who is hearing from a lot of these researchers when they release reports, there's a lot of great stuff that is out there that doesn't have the most dubious funding, but the access to media is so far below what these corporate funded think tanks are able to achieve, that it's kind of like, if we're talking about saturation or we're talking about balance here, like in the balance here is a corporate funded think tank is going to be pitching, is going to have certain reporters, many reporters on speed dial, right? Or if anyone even uses a phone, but you know what I mean? In their Rolodex, right? Can get right to those voices to then amplify the messaging that they want. Whereas researchers that are doing phenomenal work don't have those direct connections in the same way, and therefore struggle to have their own research or their own voices reach those same levels of prominence and certainly distribution.
Yeah. And then, I think the problem even beyond that is like, sure, okay, like what? You build the relationships, you dog these reporters and you go through and you build the rapport and like you finally get your story in there. And then I'm not talking about any specific examples, but like it's not uncommon for there to be higher level decisions that make your decision for you. And so I think that's a big part of this too. Like there is no shortage of, mainstream media parading as being neutral and objective, like saying, why are you quoting this lefty organizer? Or why are you quoting this lefty researcher? And so, yeah, how do you get around that? Hopefully getting more people into these institutions that can push back on those things. But like, it's a pretty, again, like I'm a very cynical person, so take this with a grain of salt, but it's a pretty bleak landscape. And so, part of me thinks, yes, like there needs to be sort of an equal and opposite development of forces that can sort of infiltrate and get their stories into media to compete with the centrist machine here, the think tank machine. But I also think that there needs to be sort of more strategic thinking about like, what are the other ways that you can sort of get your message across, whether that's, there's some people that are working on this right now, but again, it feels like every lefty organization, every progressive organization is doing 50,000 things at once. But I think like the bottom line is even the places that are doing this well and are getting their message into mainstream media, I'm thinking about some of the political groups that have gotten more coverage in recent electoral cycles, and I have election brain, so forgive me for that. But like, even people who do sort of achieve that, we're still reacting to content that's already out there, research that's already out there. And so I think the key is like really like figuring out how do you drive the agenda rather than like constantly being on the back foot and being like, oh, well, the Manhattan Institute put out this policy paper. Like, well, look what we found. It's like, no, like there needs to be, and this is something that has to be built over time. Obviously, like it's not going to happen overnight, but I think that's sort of one of the biggest missteps is thinking that you can get your message across by constantly just responding and rebutting to everything that somebody else is saying. And that's just not gonna cut it.
Right. Because being perpetually defensive and reactive means like you're actually not in control.
It's not a good look.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. You're just playing in like the think tank world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, it's such a liberal solution, and it's not really even a solution. It's kind of just like a Band-Aid, but I just feel like basic disclosure would actually go a long way. But it's like, so again, I think it would everybody sort of knows that it would defeat the purpose, so nobody does it. Because I've asked reporters before who I've sort of criticized the New York Times. The New York Times, as we mentioned earlier, did a huge expose on how CSIS was directly lobbying for its funders, weapons contractors who make drones. And then like 2 weeks later, they're citing a whole CSIS report about how much the US needs to get ice cutters. These very large, expensive ships in the Arctic, because the evil Russians have 7 and the US only had 2. Never mind that the Russian Arctic coast is 14 times the size as the American Arctic coast. And then I was like, well, the CSI, they funded the study, and their funders are the most likely ones to get the contract, which is going to be worth billions of dollars. I mean, these things are very expensive.
Yeah.
And I emailed the New York Times reporter. They're like, yeah, it's a study. What do you want from me? Like the work's done for you. And it's like, again, it's like the evil Russians, this, that. And it's like, well, yeah, of course they're going to say the Russians are, we have to, there's always, again, it's this missile gap bullshit. Because if they said, well, disclosure, the study was funded by, Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all these sort of military contractors, it would sort of make it seem icky and corrupt. So they just don't do it.
Yeah. But also, like, if you publish a story with that disclaimer, like, people don't even read the whole story. So, like, I don't see the New York Times, like, putting that disclaimer at the top of their story. And I think, like, just having the story in the first place is the problem. Like, that is, I'm not saying that you disagree with that.
Right. But I feel like it would at least orient a certain skeptical media reader to be like, think about it. Like, I think most people don't think about it. Like, if you call something the like Center for like the Advancement of People, or like the North Center for the Atlantic, the
United Democracy Project. Yeah.
Your brain turns off and you're like, oh yeah, they seem but they're like just a bunch of bespectacled academics who are just, sat down and crunched the numbers and realized we have an ice cutter gap. And it's like, well, yeah, because, Northrop Grumman and Boeing are the ones that could be making
they make them
ice cutter. Right. And so it's like, and obviously there's ideology, and there's all these different things that kind of turn into this kind of corrupt ooze of media output. But it's like, I think most people don't actually know, like, think tank sounds so benign. It sounds so academic, and it's just not, because if it was academic, it would be in academia. And again, academia is not perfect, but like there are way more firewalls in academia. And again, I think it's like, how do we make it seem academic and have the veneer and the kind of aesthetic of academia? Because I've been to the CSIS headquarters in DC, and I've sat down at one of their little seminars about the evil Iranians or Chinese or Russians are going to kill us all, brought to you by Lockheed Martin. And it sort of feels like a very expensive university, and that's what they're going for.
Yeah, that's the whole point. Yeah. Well, this has been so great, Akela. Before we let you go, can you let us and our listeners know what are you working on that we can look out for?
Yeah, so if you care about APAC spending in primaries, I'm doing a lot on that. But if you don't care about that, and I don't blame you, because I'm kind of sick of hearing about it at this point right now. There is a lot going on in sort of the prosecutor space, backlash to reform. I'm hopefully writing about sort of, I don't know how closely people have followed Ron DeSantis's spree of suspending democratically elected prosecutors that he doesn't like, but there is some nefarious stuff going on in Florida with refusal to respond to records requests about some of the communications that his office has had with law enforcement about the suspension of Monique Worrell. So hopefully getting something up on that. And also relatedly hoping to do some stuff on another attempt to suppress the right to getting public records in Georgia right now around Cop City stuff. So yeah, lots of super fun, not niche at all.
No, but look, very, very, very important, and can't thank you enough for your work. We have been speaking with Akela Lacey, politics reporter at The Intercept. Akela, again, thank you so much for joining us today on Citations Needed.
Thank you guys for having me on. This is super fun.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's a lot of people find surprising who've never looked into these things is how think tanks don't actually have to disclose funders. To the extent they do it, it's usually to stay in good standing with nonprofit observer groups and to signal to other donors that they're legit. But a lot of these, especially right-wing ones, because we didn't really cover those in this episode, that's maybe for a different episode, is that you don't even know who the hell's funding them. So they exist as a laundromat. They're sort of a classic laundromat, influence laundromat, because you need to hide the kind of origins of the funding. And again, this exists on a spectrum. Certain think tanks, we have them on our show. We think they're mostly good. Their funders are dispersed enough or kind of scrappy enough. Their website looks like shit. That's usually a good indicator they're not as venal. Do you look like a GeoCity? Okay, you can come on Citations. And I think that it's a spectrum. You sort of call it at a certain point and say, okay, this is kind of crossing into a line of kind of more overt corruption. And that's why I think Again, it's just kind of we're not asking for guillotines here, right? This is a very liberal demand, which is like, can you at least disclose so people know? And I think that's really where you give the game away, because if they did that, they would be far, far less funded and far less influential, because their kind of nominal or widely perceived neutrality or kind of academia sheen or branding is what gives them power. It's what gives them purchase in media.
Yeah. And I mean, that kind of purchase is also dependent on really who the audiences are, right? I mean, there's like your casual liberal New York Times, New Yorker reader who sees expert commentary from a, Center for Defense Priorities and Trusted Democracies, and it's like, oh, okay, like this person sounds like an academic. They come from a university. Now they work at a think tank. And okay, that seems like a sound policy. But the thing is, like, polls have shown, namely a poll from 2018 by a UK firm that polled American media consumers, cast from Clay, found that just 20% of American news consumers trust what think tanks have to say. So really, it's like, what is the value of this expertise? And it is this laundering of corporations, of anti-labor crusaders into the media, laundering it through reportage, laundering it through expert commentary, and getting it right back to the very policymakers that are going to continue giving money to, say, the weapons manufacturers, right? So there's this closed loop. And this actually reminds me of something that can be found in the book Manufacturing Consent, the section, A Propaganda Model, of course, Manufacturing Consent from 1988, seminal work by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. And in it, they write this, quote, "The relation between power and sourcing extends beyond official and corporate provision of day-to-day news to shaping the supply of, quote-unquote, experts. The dominance of official sources is weakened by the existence of highly respectable, unofficial sources that give dissident views with great authority. This problem is alleviated by, quote, co-opting the experts. That is, putting them on the payroll as consultants, funding their research, and organizing think tanks that will hire them directly and help disseminate their messages. In this way, bias may be structured, and the supply of experts may be skewed in the direction desired by the government and the quote-unquote market. As now the dear and departed Henry Kissinger has pointed out, in this age of the expert, the constituency of the expert is, quote, those who have a vested interest in commonly held opinions. Elaborating and defining its consensus at a high level has, after all, made him an expert." End quote.
Right. It's fundamentally about expert and expertise, which most random people who are busy and have, 2 jobs and they're picking up their kids from daycare, they don't have time to interrogate the conflicts of interest of various experts. They see an expert, they think, well, if the New York Times picked him or if CNN picked him, he must be somewhat impartial or not invested in this particular topic. But, many of them are. And that would not be possible without think tanks. It just wouldn't.
Yeah, that is how those opinions are then laundered through the media and back to our political class. So that will do it for this episode of Citations Needed. Thank you all for listening. Of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/CitationsNeededPodcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated, as we are 100% listener funded, not think tank funded. And as always, a very special shout out goes to our critic level supporters through Patreon. They include Brad Hayward, Zach Cathcart, Lorenzo Mitchell, Ben Lazar, Morgan Green Hopkins, Ed Zitron, Corporate Zombie, Eric Joyner, Buzz Among Us, Stinky Pete, DL Singfield, JM Geralt, Chris Vincent, Nigel Kirby, Scott Roth, Porter Schutz, Zachary Henson, Josh Durlam, Joe Wengert, Steely Dan Halen, Douglas, Danger Manley, Green New Neil, Trazdat, Brickshop Audio, Supple Old Man, David McMurray, MSP, William Rush, Garrett Geiser, Political Zombie, Extra Domum, Gwendolyn, Kyle, Heather Redacted, Kevin Bowman, Anna Marie Kane, Jason Eason, Chris Sarah, Dash X, James Michaela, Greg Westneat, Drew Johnson, Max Belanger, David Bettner, Brendan O'Connor, Ultra Miraculous, Zappo, Sturm Wyvern, Darren Brady, Bart DeCourcy, Ra, Max Wilsey, Blake Bunell, Xenia Zadvornik, Tatiana Maslani, Tsukimi Yuki, Psychic Pizza, Panic Emoji, Brendan Hines, Doc Reitzel, Philip Moss, Rulers Bar, Jameson Saltzman, A Very Throwable Brick, Bitcoin Wallet Inspector, Shockfist, Weed Lord, AI Scare, Backups, Care, and of course, Computer Scare. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
Citations Needed senior producer is Florence Burrow Adams. Our producer is Julianne Tweeten. Production assistant is Trenda Lightburn. Newsletter is by Marco Cardilano. Transcriptions are by Mahnor Imran. The music is by Grandaddy. Thanks again, everyone. We'll catch you next time.